1717 smelled like wet rope, rotten citrus, and money that had learned to swim. After the great wrecks spat silver along the Florida shore, every ambitious idiot with a sail called himself Opportunity. Ports filled with men who had never reefed a topsail in anger and still talked like admirals. Charts changed hands over dice. Rum did more recruiting than any drum. The Caribbean did not care who you had been ashore. It cared whether your hull floated and whether your luck held past the next squall line. I was Calder Cal Vane, 19, ordinary as a nail, working a leaky merchant brig called Patience, a name that deserved mockery every time the pumps started their tired song. Cal to anyone who bothered with a short name. Vane because my father had been a Vane and left me little else but shoulders that could take a hawser and a habit of counting risks before I counted coins. Wiry sailor build, salt-bleached brown hair that never quite dried, tar-stained hands, plain shirt, plain neckerchief, and a grin I used when silence would draw more questions than a joke. Patience hauled mixed cargo between islands that pretended to be loyal and islands that pretended not to notice. Indigo, sugar, barrels that leaked sticky truths, a little dry goods for planters who paid late. Our captain was a careful man in the way careful men die carefully. He feared storms more than pirates, and pirates more than God, which put God last on a list that never quite balanced. The mate drank, the boatswain cursed in 3 languages and meant all of them. The crew was the usual stew of debt, desertion, and boys who thought the sea would make them rich if they only kept scrubbing. I scrubbed, I spliced, I stood watches with eyes that learned every creak of the hull so I would know which ones mattered. Ordinary work, ordinary fear. In a year like that, ordinary was a kind of armor. Too much shine got you noticed. Too much talk got you remembered. I preferred to be useful and forgettable, the sort of hand who got paid and left alone. We took a squall off a quay that did not forgive maps. 1 hour the sky was the color of old pewter and honest enough. The next, the wind stood up on its hind legs and kicked. Rain came sideways and filled your mouth if you opened it to shout. The sea stacked itself into walls and then into holes. Patience healed hard enough that green water came over the rail like a judgment. The mainmast complained in a voice I had heard before on ships that later sold for scrap. Stays sang. A hatch cover tore free and became a weapon. Men slid. Casks broke their lashings and rolled with murderous patience. The captain prayed to a god who clearly preferred admirals. His words washed away as soon as he spoke them. I was at the fore when the boom swung. Someone had misjudged a sheet. Someone always does when the world turns to noise. The spar kissed my skull hard enough to put white light behind my eyes and soft enough that I still had time to feel my feet leave the deck. The rail passed under me like a thought I failed to finish. Then there was only water, cold and absolute, writing its name in my chest. I sank, salt filled my nose, my lungs tried to refuse the bargain and lost. The first breath of water is not a breath, it is a betrayal. Pressure climbed my ribs, sound went thick. Above me the hull of Patience was a dark belly moving away, indifferent as weather. Bubbles left me in a rush and rose toward a surface I could no longer name. My arms moved because arms are stupid and keep trying. My legs kicked the way drowning men kick, which is to say, without plan and without pride. I thought of nothing holy. I thought of the unpaid wage chalked against my name in the mate's book. I thought of a girl in a port who had laughed at my neckerchief and meant it kindly. I thought of how ridiculous it was to die for a brig called Patience in a squall that would not even earn a footnote in a governor's letter. The sea did not argue, it simply took. Water has a weight that landsmen never believe until it sits on them. It pressed my ears, it pressed my eyes. The light above thinned to a coin and then to a rumor. My chest burned with a fire that had no air to feed it. I counted without meaning to, the old habit of a mind that likes tallies when panic arrives. 1, 2, 3. The numbers did not help. They only marked how far from useful I had become. Something in the dark below was not water. I did not see it so much as meet it with the back of my hand, the way you meet a table edge in a black cabin. Hard, wrong, present. My fingers closed because fingers close on anything when the alternative is empty death. Leather, cold clasp, a shape that had no business existing under a kicking sea off an unmapped quay. For a stupid half-second, I thought it was a cask stave or a dead man's satchel. Then the weight of it settled into my grip like it had been waiting for a signature. The sea hesitated, not calmed, not stilled, hesitated, as if some clerk in the deep had looked up from a ledger and found my name written in a hand he almost recognized. The current's shove lost its certainty. The crushing hurry of drowning skipped a beat. My lungs were still full of failure. My skull still rang from the boom, but the water around the thing in my hand felt briefly like a held breath. I blacked out on the yes of that moment, if yes is the word for a drowning man accepting any bargain that is not the bottom. Darkness came clean, no tunnel, no choir, just the simple end of counting. I did not expect to open my eyes again. Expectation is a luxury of men with air. What I carried into that black was only the leather under my palm and the stubborn animal refusal to let go. Somewhere far above, patience fought the squall without me. Somewhere in the ports, men still argued over wreck silver and roots and which flag brought the least trouble. None of that reached the place I went. There was only pressure, and then nothing, and then the strange certainty that the nothing had noticed me back. I should have been fish food. Instead, my hand found leather and refused to open. When the world returned, it returned ugly. Sun-hot deck, brine in my throat, the broken forecourse tangled around me like a net that had changed its mind about mercy. I puked seawater onto planks that steamed. Someone was shouting my name wrong, and then right. Hands rolled me. A shadow blocked the glare and became the bosun's ruined face, salt in his whiskers, eyes wide with the particular anger of men who hate surprises that look like miracles. Lucky, someone called me. Jonah, someone else said, which is what sailors call a man who falls into the sea and comes back carrying weather. I coughed until my ribs hurt and tasted copper under the salt. My skull throbbed where the boom had kissed me. The squall had moved on the way squalls do, leaving a sky scrubbed raw and a sea still sulking in long swells. Patience wallowed, wounded but upright, yards askew, men moving with the frantic calm of a crew that has just learned it can still die later. Under my palm, still as if sewn there, lay the book, heavy as a grudge, leather dark with water and alder stains, a clasp of dull black metal that felt like a tooth against my thumb. No guilt, no title, no saint's name to make a chaplain happy. It was the size of a thick psalter and the weight of something that had decided not to sink when sinking was the fashion. My fingers had locked on it so hard the joints ached when I finally loosened them. I hid it in my shirt before eyes became questions. That took doing. Men were close. One tried to pull me upright, and I let him, turning my body so the bulk under the wet linen looked like nothing more than a bent spine and a bad recovery. I coughed again on purpose. I muttered thanks. I played the half-drowned fool because the half-drowned fool gets water and a blanket and fewer inspections. The book sat against my stomach like a second spine. Cold at first, then not cold, as if it had opinions about temperature. They got me below out of the wind. The sick bay was a polite name for a corner with a hammock and a box of rags. The surgeon's mate, who was mostly a butcher with better manners on Sundays, looked at my head, declared me thick-skulled, and told me not to sleep if I felt the world sliding. I nodded. I did not mention the book. I did not mention the hesitation in the sea. Men who talk like that get chains or prayers, and both end poorly. Alone for a few breaths when he went for a dry shirt, I slid the book free and looked at it properly. The leather was not local cow. It had a grain like something that had lived deeper than pastures. The clasp did not want fingers. It wanted intention. When I pressed my thumb to it, it warmed a fraction, and the catch gave with a sound too small for the size of the moment. Inside, pages, thick, cream turned grey by age or by deep water. At first they were blank, pure as a lie told carefully. Then ink rose, not poured, not brushed, rose like blood through water. dark lines finding the shapes of letters as if the page remembered them from a dream. The hand was almost mine. That chilled me more than the drowning. Almost mine meant the book had looked at me and borrowed a future version of my writing, or an older version, or the version I used when I was honest. The first line settled and stayed. I shut it hard. The clasp clicked like a mouth closing on a secret. Footsteps returned. I stuffed the book back under my shirt and accepted the dry cloth like a saint accepting penance. The surgeon's mate asked if I saw lights or angels. I told him I saw the bottom of the bilge and my own stupidity. He laughed, relieved. Miracles make work. Stupidity fits the watch bill. Night came slow. The pumps kept their beat. I volunteered for a turn in the dark spaces where fewer eyes traveled, claiming my head preferred quiet. No one argued. Jonah gets a little room if Jonah still hauls. In the cable tier's stink and coil shadow, I sat with my back to wet hemp and opened the book again by the light of a carefully shielded stub of candle. Blank. Then the ink, patient as tide. Article 1. The sea keeps what it names. Name yourself captain of your breath. My mouth went dry in a way salt water had not managed. I whispered because even half drowned I was not stupid enough to perform for the crew or for God or for whatever listened through timber. I am captain of my breath. The next breath came in like a stolen prize. My lungs, raw from the drowning, opened easier than they had in years. The wheeze I had carried since a bad fever in Kingston loosened. Air went deep and came back clean. It was not bliss, it was authority. Small authority, the size of one pair of ribs, but real enough that my hands shook and I had to steady the candle with both palms. A second line ghosted under the first, smaller, like a clerk's marginal note. Keep me secret or hang twice. I already knew, you do not need a magic book to understand that power without silence is a short road to a cage. In 1717, the noose was busy. Governors wanted order. Merchants wanted insurance rates that did not scream. The Navy wanted a theater of justice when they could spare the ships from European messes. A boy with a talking ledger would not get a lecture. He would get a trial measured in minutes and a drop measured in feet. I closed the book. I wrapped it in oilcloth scavenged from a torn weather cover. I bound it against my chest under the shirt with a strip of canvas so it would not shift when I climbed. Then I went back up among living men and practiced being ordinary. Ordinary is harder once the sea has hesitated for you. Every inhale felt like a private joke. Every exhale felt like a promise I had not fully read. Above us, the stars came out sharp. Somewhere, a man sang a dirty song to keep the pump gang timed. The captain stood by the binnacle and pretended the compass was a friend. I smiled when spoken to. I answered to Cal. I did not touch the place over my heart where law now ticked like a second pulse. The book had written back. I had answered. That was the whole of my new religion, and I meant to keep its church windowless. Below, in the bilge dark, the book taught me that blankness is only a waiting room. I went down when the middle watch turned and the deck noise thinned to creaks and the occasional curse. Patience leaked the way old brigs leak, a constant weep into the low places where rats held parliament and the air tasted of old iron, wet wood, and the sour ghost of cargo long since sold. I took a lantern with the shield nearly closed, just a knife edge of light, and found a seat on a stringer above the worst of the water. The oilcloth packet came free from my chest. My fingers were steady. That surprised me. Fear usually makes me precise, not calm. This was something adjacent to calm, the focus of a man filing a blade before a fight he has already accepted. I opened the clasp. Article 1 still sat on the page in that almost mine hand, captain of my breath. I inhaled and felt the ease again. Not a drunk's ease, not laudanum, just the simple competence of lungs that obeyed. Under it, the warning remained, secret or hang twice. I did not need a sermon. I needed rules I could test without painting a target on the mast. I turned a page, fresh blank. I waited. The book did not perform on command like a trained monkey. It watched, if paper can watch, and offered when the offering suited its appetite. After a long minute, a pale line ghosted and faded, as if considering whether I deserved more ink. I pricked my thumb on a fid's tip I had brought for the purpose. Blood welled dark. I let a drop fall to the lower margin because the drowning had taught me the book liked honesty paid in the body. The drop sank into the page without spreading. Ink rose to meet it. Not a full article, a fragment, witness, blood, claimable deck. The words arranged themselves like the start of a contract written by something that had read too many ship's articles and found them adorable. I understood in the gut before I understood in the head. This thing did not gift miracles to pure hearts. It bound local sea and ship reality to rules spoken and sealed. Limits lived in the gaps. No witness, no grip. No blood, no binding. No deck you could claim as the field of play. No board for the game. Patience was not my deck, not truly. I was a hand. The captain still held the imaginary line that runs from keel to truck and calls itself authority. But my breath was mine. The book had started me small on purpose or by law. Small was survivable. I tried a second whisper, not writing yet, just tasting the shape. I am captain of this bilge. Nothing happened except me feeling stupid. The air stayed foul. The water stayed water. The book remained cool. So the naming had to fit. Breath had fit because drowning had made the claim true enough to sign. Pretending I owned the ship's guts was a child's game, and the deep does not play with children unless it means to eat them. I wiped my thumb and listened hard for feet on the ladder. Only the hull speaking to itself. Somewhere forward, a pump sucked and spat. That should have sent me up the ladder to throw the whole packet over the side. I am not proud that it did not. 19 is a stupid age dressed as courage. Also, I had already drowned once that week. Returning the gift to the giver felt like volunteering for a second lesson. More than that, the breath in my chest was better, cleaner. I could feel the difference the way you feel a splinter gone. Once the body knows relief, the mind invents reasons to keep it. A soft noise at the hatch made me kill the lantern slit with my palm. Boots, a voice calling for a spare piece of spun yarn. I wrapped the book, bound it home against my skin, and was standing with a coil of junk line in my hands when the carpenter's mate came down muttering. He saw me, grunted, took the line, and left. If he smelled blood, he blamed the bilge. If he saw my face, he blamed the knock on my head. I waited until his steps faded, and only then let my shoulders drop. Alone again, I opened once more and whispered a question I felt foolish for asking. What are you? The page remained blank long enough that I almost laughed at myself. Then a single line, dry as a clerk's joke. Black article, no thee, no holy, just the name like a brand on a cask. Under it, smaller, the same warning as before, as if repetition were a kindness. Keep me secret or hang twice. I nodded in the dark like a man accepting articles at a tavern table, with men who would cut him if he welched. I did not sleep much when I went back to my hammock. The book's weight was a constant argument against my ribs. Around me men snored, muttered, scratched. The ship rolled the long leftover roll of a sea that had spent its rage and not yet found peace. I stared at the deckhead and thought about names. Calder Vane, Cal, Ordinary Nail, Captain of my breath. The last one felt more true with every easy lungful, and that truth was a rope that could hang me if I let anyone else hold the end. Near dawn, I went on deck for air that did not taste of bilge. The eastern sky was a thin grey knife. A lookout yawned at his post. Far off, a brown bird stitched the swell. I breathed as the book had taught me and felt the sea listen a fraction closer than it listened to other men who had nearly died and come back empty-handed. Not love, not friendship, attention. The way a dealer attends to a new player who has put real coin on the table. I kept my face plain. I nodded to the lookout. I spat over the side for luck, the old way, the worthless way, the way that keeps you looking like everyone else. Inside my shirt, the black article sat quiet. In my head, the first law of my private church had already formed, simple enough to remember when boards started screaming. Never show the book. the rest would come. Appetite would come. Trouble would come on a sail I could not yet see on the horizon. For that hour I had breath, a secret, and a brig still mostly afloat. In 1717, that counted as a winning hand, if you did not count too carefully, and if you did not listen too hard to the deep hiring behind your heartbeat. We were not saved. A sloop with no honest colours found our crippled brig 2 days after the squall, and fired a polite chain shot through our remaining pride. I was aloft when the lookout's shout went thin and wrong. Sail. Then the shape of her resolved out of the morning haze, low and fast, too clean in the lines for a fat trader, and too bold in her approach for anyone with clean papers. She flew a flag that might have been Spanish if you were drunk, and English if you were desperate, and neither if you had eyes. Men like that do not ask for your health. They ask for your cargo and your willingness to die over it. Patience could not run. Our mast still complained. Our best canvas was patchwork. The captain ordered up what little powder we had and tried to look like a man with choices. The sloop ranged us with lazy confidence. Chain shot went through the upper gear with a giant iron rattle. Rope and wood rained. The captain opened his mouth to order strike or fight or pray and died mid-word when a musket ball found his throat. He sat down hard as if resting. He did not get up. The world narrowed to wet wood and screaming. Boarders hooked on, grapnels bit our rail. Their hull ground ours. Men came over like a spilled sack of knives. Our crew met them with what we had. Cutlasses that had seen more rust than glory. Belaying pins, a few pistols that might fire if God was bored enough to allow it. I dropped to the deck and rolled under the first swing that tried to open my shoulder. The man above me smelled of onions and black powder. I put my knife in the place under his ribs where sailors keep their second thoughts and shoved him back toward his friends. It was not brave. It was arithmetic. Smoke thickened. A gun on their side barked and took a chunk of our capstan. Splinters flew like angry bees. I saw the boatswain go down under 2 men and come up with one of them's ear between his teeth, which was only red and loud in the moment. The mate was nowhere I could see. Leadership had become a local matter, decided 3 feet at a time. A boarding axe came for my head. I saw the arc. I did not have room to be proud. I fell sideways behind a water barrel lashed near the mainmast partners, and the axe bit staves instead of bone. Water jetted cold across the deck. The man yanked his weapon free and cursed in a language that had traveled farther than he had. My hand was already inside my shirt. The book came free, sticky with sweat. I tore a page edge with my thumbnail, a ragged strip, not a full leaf, because some animal part of me still hoped to keep the thing whole. I bled on it because the book wanted honesty, and my thumb remembered the fid. The blood looked black in the shadow of the barrel. I scratched words with the nail while pressed into the narrow, stinking space, letters crude as a child, meaning sharp as a hook. Article 2. On this deck, for 1 glass, enemy locks fail the hand that hates me. I did not know if glass meant time or just poetry. A sand glass runs about 30 minutes if no one kicks it. Poetry runs until it kills you. I said the words under my breath as I wrote them, sealing with spit and blood and the kind of focus you only get when the alternative is an axe in your face. The scrap warmed. The book in my other hand warmed with it, as if approving the clause or merely recording it. Ink that was not my blood darkened the scratches until they looked printed by a cruel press. I shoved the book away under canvas and shirt an instant before the axeman found his angle again. He had a pistol in his offhand, close enough that I saw the pan, the ugly little promise of it. He put the muzzle near my cheek, almost intimate, and pulled. The lock clicked on empty when it should have bloomed fire. No flash, no ball, just a dry mechanical failure that had no business arriving so politely. His eyes went wide. In that wideness, I put a fid through his throat, the same fid that had fed the book earlier, and felt the hot spill over my knuckles. He dropped. The axe skittered. I stood up into a fight that had begun to tilt. Not every gun failed. I need that said plain. because lies about power get you killed when the next lock works. A musket from their tops punched a hole in our deck 2 paces from my foot. A pistol somewhere aft made a red flower of a patience man I had shared biscuit with 2 nights prior. But enough locks failed. Enough blades slipped in sweaty hands at the wrong beat. A man swinging for my neck found his cutlass suddenly heavy, as if the air had turned to tar for him alone. I did not stand and marvel. I moved through the gaps the article made and made them wider with steel and spite. Claimable deck, the Bilge Dark Lesson had said. This deck was under contest. Blood on it from both sides, witnesses screaming. My clause did not make me a god. It made the local rules lean. That lean was enough to keep my head on my neck while I fought toward the rail, where their grapnels bit. I cut 1 grapnel line. A powder-streaked boy from our crew cut another without being asked. Their boarders felt the shift the way animals feel weather. Some pressed harder. Others cursed damp powder and bad luck, which is what secret law wears in public. I kept my mouth shut about articles. I shouted ordinary things. Push, hold, to the hooks. My voice sounded like any frightened sailor trying to sound brave. Inside, each breath still answered to me, clean and deep, while men around me wheezed smoke. Captain of my breath, owner of 1 ugly clause for 1 unknown glass. The sloop's men had numbers and practice. We had desperation and a book that wrote in blood. The barrel behind me finally collapsed into staves and a wet stain. I stepped over the axeman without looking at his face again. Looking makes ghosts. Ghosts make hesitation. Hesitation ends clauses early. Above the noise, their master shouted about finishing the cattle. Red sash, once fine hat. I filed the sash for later without writing it down. For now, the only glass that mattered was the one I had bought with a torn page and a torn thumb, ticking somewhere the eye could not see, turning my fear into a temporary local weather of failed locks and slipped grips. I used it. I did not love it yet. Love would come later, the way you love loaded dice after they buy you 1 more sunrise. Not every gun failed. Not every enemy fell. Enough did. The fight on Patience's deck became a shoving match with edges. Their boarders still had skill. One of them nearly opened my belly with a dagger when I overcommitted on a cut. I felt the cloth part and the skin burn, and then my own article seemed to snag his wrist for a blink, not stopping him clean, just spoiling the depth of the thrust. I headbutted him because elegance is for men with room. He staggered. Someone else knifed him from the side. I did not thank whoever it was. Thanks are for after. Wind twitched our yards in a way the helmsman later blamed on God. The squall's leftover air had been fluky all morning, but this was ruder. A sudden push that laid Patience a fraction off and ground her rail against the sloop at a meaner angle. Their footing suffered. Ours did too, but we were already dancing on home planks. I blamed the book and loved it the way you love loaded dice, which is to say with gratitude and the beginnings of addiction. I had not written wind. I had written locks. If the deep threw in a breeze as interest on my blood, I would not file a complaint. We drove them off messy. Messy means men screaming between hulls, grapnels taking fingers, and Job from Barbados swinging a rammer until it broke and then swinging the stump. Messy means the red-sashed master calling retreat because the glass of easy murder had cracked. 1 fool of ours followed onto their deck for glory. A pistol that had not failed taught the rest the edge of the clause. Home deck, not theirs. Claim what you can hold. Their sloop shoved off with boat hooks and curses. Chain shot had hurt us. Boarding had hurt us more. But they did not stay to finish. Maybe they sighted another sail. Maybe they disliked the way their pistols had begun to act like toys. Maybe the red sash felt the world lean and chose richer, stupider prey. I watched their stern until smoke and distance made it a toy. Only then did I let my knees tip me against the mast. Patience lived, barely. The pumps were screaming work before the blood had dried. The carpenter ran his hands over the wounds in the rail and talked to the wood like a priest. Bodies went over the side with as much cloth as we could spare and as little speech as we could manage. The captain went with them. Authority went with him into the blue. What remained was a mate with shaking hands, a bosun with one ear torn half off, and a crew that kept glancing at me when they thought I was not looking. Men slapped my back and called me Stormborn. I smiled with black water still in my molars from the earlier drowning and the newer fight and said nothing about articles. I said I got lucky. I said the axeman's powder was wet. I said any fool can stick a fid if the other fool misses. They laughed the high laugh of survivors. Someone passed a bottle that had been saved for a better day. The better day had become this day by force. I drank enough to smell of it and not enough to loosen the wrong words. In my shirt, the book ticked like a second heart made of law. I found a quiet moment behind the galley house, which was still standing by some joke of geometry, and checked the scrap of page. The words of Article 2 were fading, not gone, but losing their hard black insistence, as if the glass were emptying. My thumb had already crusted. Fresh blood would buy more clauses. I did not write one. The fight was over. Spending law for comfort is how you go bankrupt in a hurry. I slipped the scrap into the book and clasped it. The leather felt warmer than sun could explain. The mate tried to hold a council by the broken capstan. His voice cracked when he listed the dead. He wanted to know if we ran for the nearest port or tried to keep the cargo schedule like good little merchants. The bosun spat and said cargo does not bury you. A gunner with a bandaged scalp said the sloop might circle back. Eyes kept finding me. I was still just cow, still just a hand, but boarding makes new math. Men who stand when others fold become numbers in other men's heads. Numbers become expectations. Expectations become ropes around your feet. I spoke once, carefully, like a man mentioning weather. Port, repair, sell what spoils before it rots, keep the powder dry and the watches doubled. The mate nodded too fast, grateful for any sentence that sounded like a plank over mud. No one called it command. Everyone felt the tilt. I felt it too, and did not smile about it where they could see. Inside, the captain of my breath took a slow inventory. Lungs good, cut on the belly shallow, book secret, claws dying on schedule. Crew watching, horizon empty for now. We buried names in our heads instead of under dirt. I remembered the biscuit sharer with the red flower in his shirt. I remembered the captain's last unfinished order. I did not remember the axeman's face on purpose. At dusk, the sea went the color of a bruise and the wind settled into a steady push that finally favored us. Unfair wind if you asked the sloop. Fair enough if you asked the book. I stood my watch and listened to the hull complain and answered each complaint with work. Later men would say we were blessed. Blessing is a story survivors tell so the dead do not feel wasted. What we had was a lean in the rules and a boy too stubborn to drown cleanly. I meant to keep the difference private. Public miracles attract chaplains, hangmen, and imitators. Private unfairness builds a longer career. When the stars came, I touched the shape of the book under cloth and felt it answer with heat like a living rat curled against my ribs. Not affection, attention. The deep had taken its cut of blood and time and left me standing. I intended to remain standing long enough to learn what greater articles cost and whether I could afford them without becoming the kind of story other men whisper as a warning. Patience pointed her battered nose toward water that promised a coast. I breathed. The breath was mine, the win was mine, stolen and messy and paid for in page and skin. That was enough for one day. Enough is a sailor's word for not dead yet. I wore it like a medal no one else could see. By the second morning after the boarding, luck had become the ship's favorite word, and I had become its walking proof. They told the story wrong in the way all good stories go wrong. In one version, I had laughed at the pistol. In another, I had caught the axe bare-handed. Job swore he saw a light around me, which was either smoke glare or rum, and I told him so to his face until he grinned and took it back. The bosun, ear stitched with sail twine, only watched me while he worked and once said, quiet, that wet powder does not choose sides so neatly. I met his eyes and shrugged. Shrugging is a language. It says you heard and will not help. I took the worst jobs on purpose. Pumps, splinter cleanup, stitching canvas until my fingers bled new blood that was only needlework. Ordinary strain puts a smell of sweat and tar back on a man. Miracles smell like fear and questions. I wanted the first smell thick enough to hide the second. When the gunner asked again how the pistol had failed against my cheek, I gave him damp powder and a blessing and a joke about the axeman's shaking hand. He wanted a talisman. I gave him a shrug and a share of my biscuit. Food closes more mouths than argument. Still the glances came. Men who survive boarding become either captains or corpses, and I was neither yet. The space between those poles is where crews invent leaders because empty air at the top of the ladder makes everyone dizzy. The mate felt it. He started asking my opinion on small things with his voice pitched to sound like orders he had already decided. Where to shift the remaining casks, whether to cut a sprung yard or fish it. I answered short and practical and never let my tone climb into anything that sounded like a claim. Claims are written. I had already written enough. At night, I checked the book in the cable tier's privacy. Article 2 had gone fully pale, spent. Article 1 remained, steady as a brand, captain of my breath. The warning about secrecy sat under it like a second pulse. I turned pages and found no new gifts waiting, only the blank appetite of paper that expected me to pay if I wanted more weather on my side. I did not write. The ship was quiet enough. Spending blood law to make pumps easier would have been gluttony. Gluttony rebounds. I did not know that as a proven law yet. I suspected it the way you suspect a reef by the color of the water. I slept poorly. When I slept, I dreamed of blank pages and of the red sash on the sloop's master, always just out of cutlass range. Once I woke with my hand already on the clasp and had to force myself to let go. Dependence is another kind of drowning. The book did not mind. The book, I was learning, liked hunger. Hunger keeps a holder coming back with fresh terms and fresh blood. I would teach it patience if I could. If I could not, I would at least not be the kind of fool who writes a clause every time a hatch slams. On deck at sunrise, the carpenter showed me a section of rail where the grapnels had bitten deepest. The wood was crushed in a pattern like teeth. He said we were lucky the strakes below had held. I ran my hand along the damage and thought about claimable decks, about how thin the difference is between a home plank and a coffin lid. Patience was still not mine. She was a wounded merchant brig with a dead captain and a cargo that might pay for repairs if the market was kind and the port officials were sleepy. But she had been the field where my second article lived out its glass. That made her something more than workplace and less than throne. I kept that thought off my face. A boy from the crew, younger than me, asked if I thought the pirates would come back. I told him the sea is wide and cowards prefer easy meat. I did not tell him I had watched their stern for hours in my head and measured our powder like a miser. Double watches stayed doubled. The mate agreed without fight. Fear is a fine first officer when you do not trust the real one. I mended my shirt where the dagger had kissed it and washed the blood out in a bucket until the water went pink and then clear enough. The cut on my belly was a shallow insult. I rubbed tar soap into it and hissed and carried on. Pain is honest. It does not ask you to explain luck. Around midday, a pod of porpoises ran our bow wave for a while, and men smiled like children. I smiled too. Smiling costs nothing and buys you a place in the circle. Inside the circle, I counted threats. The bosun's quiet suspicion, the mate's needy glances, the gunner's hunger for a story with a saint in it, my own mouth, which wanted to brag in the old animal way, the book, warm and patient, the horizon, which might grow a sail with honest colors or dishonest ones at any hour. 1717 was a bad year for lungs and a good year for nooses. Wreck silver had filled the ports with dreamers and the sea lanes with men who harvested dreamers. I had become both and neither, survivor, holder, ordinary hand with an extraordinary paper heart. When Job offered me first pull on a salvaged bottle that evening, I took a swallow and passed it on. "Storm-born," he said again, softer, almost kindly. I clinked an imaginary glass against his and told him to save the poetry for port girls. He laughed. The sound settled the waste for a moment. I felt the book tick once, hard, as if amused by the disguise, or merely noting that I still preferred breath to sermons. Luck is what secret gods wear in public. I wore it daily now, a costume stitched from shrugs and pump blisters and carefully unfinished sentences. Under the costume, the truth sat bound in oilcloth. I would not show it. I would not name it. I would let men call me lucky until the word became boring, and boring is the safest fame a living pirate to be can own, while his deck is still small and his articles still few. That night I sat with the book in the cable tier and felt it warm as a living rat. The cable tier is where rope lives in great coiled cities, damp and pungent, a cathedral of hemp that creaks when the ship thinks hard. Few men linger there without a job. Jobs end. I made mine last by coiling what was already coiled and counting fathoms with my lips moving so anyone who glanced down the hatch would see a sailor being thorough. When the thoroughness had built a wall of privacy, I opened the oilcloth. Candle stub, shielded light, pages. Article 1 held, breath, secret. Article 2 was a ghost of wording at the edge of a torn place, spent and already half forgotten by the paper. I did not mourn it. Clauses that last forever would make holders careless. I pricked my thumb again, less deep this time, and let a small drop touch a clean margin without writing a wish. The book drank. A new line ghosted onto the page in that almost mine hand. Not an article I had authored, a message. Write greater articles, take greater decks. The deep is hiring. I laughed soundlessly, a breath of air through teeth. Hiring, as if the abyss kept a shipping office and I had left my name with a clerk who wore fishbones for buttons. The humor did not make the line less true. I could feel the appetite under the words, not mine alone, something older wearing my handwriting like a borrowed coat. Greater articles meant greater blood, greater witnesses, greater chances to rebound and hang. Greater decks meant ships that mattered, not a leaky brig with a dead merchant captain and a hold full of spoiled schedules. I sat with that until the candle gutters threatened the dark. Somewhere east, rumor said a man named Teach was turning his beard into a national problem. Slow matches, smoke, a theater of terror that made colonial governors write letters with shaking flourishes. Kings wanted order because order taxes cleanly. Merchants wanted insurance that did not cost more than the cargo. The Navy wanted a villain worth the powder when they could spare attention from European chess. The sea, if the book could be believed, wanted a favorite. Favorites die famous. I preferred to live infamous and specific. I looked at my ruined hands, tar and blood and rope shine, and saw a future where ports lowered flags because my rules outranked theirs. Not a servant of Blackbeard, not a Navy saint with a letter of marque and a lie in his pocket. A pirate who could make the world sign his articles. Fleet-level commandments somewhere down a long red road. The thought should have scared me back into ordinary prayers. Instead, it fit against my ribs beside the book and felt like the first true ambition I had ever owned that was not merely about wages. Ambition needs laws, or it becomes a scream. I whispered 3 rules to the coils of cable, gospel for a church of one. Never show the book. Never write an article you cannot survive if it rebounds. Claim a deck before you try to rule a sea. A 4th came personal and mean. Leave enough ordinary struggle visible that men do not start prayers in my direction. Prayers attract chaplains and hangmen. Hangmen attract crowds. Crowds remember faces. The book warmed harder, as if the rules themselves were a kind of clause. Maybe they were. Maybe the deep likes holders who last long enough to become interesting. I did not write the rules in blood, not yet. Spoken law between me and me was enough for a night when the ship still stank of boarding and the pumps still argued with the sea. I turned pages looking for traps. Near the back, under a film of old salt, I found a pale diagram that might have been a deck plan of no ship I knew, annotations in a hand that was not almost mine, but almost someone else's. Dates scratched out, a name blotted until it was only a bruise. So the hiring had happened before, so someone had failed the interview. I closed that part with care. Curiosity is healthy. Archaeology on cursed paper is how you inherit other men's nooses. Above me, boots crossed the deck. A voice called the glass. Another answered. Ordinary ship night, the kind that keeps the world stitched together while monsters read in the rope dark. I blew out the candle and sat in black, book clasped, breathing as captain of my breath until my heart slowed from gospel fever to working rhythm. Then I did something the deep might not have expected. I put the book away without writing a greater article. Appetite is a tiller. If you let it steer every hour, you wreck on the first pretty reef. I would write when the deck and the blood and the witness lined up into something I could survive. Until then, the message would sit in me like a coal. Take greater decks. Not this minute. Soon enough that the coal would not go cold. I climbed back to the living spaces with hemp dust on my sleeves and an honest ache in my shoulders. Men in hammocks swung with the roll. Someone talked in his sleep about a woman who had never existed as described. I rolled into my own canvas and laid the book under my thigh, where a thief would have to move my whole body to try for it. My fist found the fid out of habit. Sleep came in pieces. In one piece, I stood on a deck far larger than patience. Black water under a moon like a coin, and every man jack aboard turned to me for a word that would become weather. In another piece, the red-sashed master from the sloop held my book over a rail and smiled as he opened his hand. I woke from that one with a snarl I turned into a cough. The cable-tier gospel still glowed behind my eyes. The deep is hiring. I had not asked for work. I had drowned into it. Resignation is just a story you tell when you intend to negotiate terms. Before dawn, I went on deck and watched the horizon pale. No sail, no teach, no navy line, only the long promise of water and the battered brig under my feet. I breathed, I hid, I planned in small practical bricks, port, repairs, silence, then a better hull, then articles written with room to live through the rebound. The sea kept its own counsel. The book kept mine. Between them I stood, 19 and still ordinary to any eye that did not know what leather ticked against my leg, and I decided that luck would remain my public name until I earned a worse one on purpose. By morning, the crew watched me with a new math. It was not worship. Worship would have been simpler and more dangerous. It was the measuring look men give a spar when they wonder if it will take sail. I felt it at the water cask, at the mess kid, at the pumps where I took my turn and sang low with them, so I would sound like meat and not miracle. Songs keep rhythm. Rhythm keeps you human in other men's ears. My voice is nothing special. That helped. Saints are supposed to sound like silver. I sounded like a boy who had swallowed smoke. The gunner found me while I was greasing a truck wheel on the remaining carriage that still looked honest. How did the pistol fail? He asked again, not accusing, hungry. Damp powder blesses who it wants, I said. He waited for more. I gave him the quiet of a man who has already used his words. After a while, he nodded, disappointed and relieved together, and talked about shot sizes instead. Numbers are safer than wonders. The bosun was harder. His torn ear had gone ugly under the twine, and pain makes some men religious and others precise. He put me on the hardest hauls and watched to see if luck did my lifting. I lifted until my shoulders burned, and my breath, still obedient, kept me from showing the shake too early. When I finally slowed, he grunted as if I had passed a test no one had announced. Good, he said, which from him was a medal. Then lower. You stand when it counts. Do not let them make you a charm. Charms get pocketed. I met his eyes and gave the smallest tip of my head. He spat and walked off. That was the closest thing to alliance I trusted. The mate called me to the quarterdeck with a voice too loud for the size of the question. He wanted a second opinion on the jury rig the carpenter had proposed for the damaged yard. I looked, I thought, I said the carpenter was right if we doubled the fish and eased sail in any real blow. The mate announced that as his decision. Men heard both parts, eyes flicked. I kept my face bored. Bored is armor. Job stuck closer than before, not quite a shadow, more like a man standing near the fire without admitting he is cold. He asked if I had a woman ashore. I invented a dull one with a dull name and a fondness for cheap ribbons. He relaxed. Men who have ordinary hungers are easier to place on the map. Men who seem complete unto themselves invite myths. Myths invite ropes. I counted the crew the way the book might count witnesses. 22 living hands still fit for work, more or less. 3 walking wounded, enough to work patients into a port if the weather stayed kind and no one started a private war over the captain's empty cabin. Already there was talk about shares, about who spoke for the owners, about whether the cargo still answered to a dead man's signature. Merchant law is a net that still catches you even when pirates have chewed the edges. I stayed out of the cabin talk. Cabins are where ambitions get loud. At midday, a sail rose far to the south, a pale chip. Hearts kicked, glasses came out. Honest trader, the lookout judged after a long stare, fat and slow and uninterested in our battered shape. We did not signal. Crippled brigs that signal sometimes get help and sometimes get a different kind of boarding under better flags. The sail slid away along its own business. The crew's shoulders dropped an inch. Mine did too, and I hated that the book stayed cool and unconsulted. Part of me had wanted a reason to write. That part needed watching. I took private inventory whenever I could pretend to check the lashings near the bow. Book still bound flat, clasp closed, no pages loose, thumb healing, belly cut scabbed, breath easy, reputation rising like a smell I could not wash off. The deep is hiring, the gospel had said. Hiring does not wait for you to finish feeling ready. Neither does a crew that has seen you stand. Near the dog watch, the mate tried a joke about making me acting third something, a title invented from fear of empty rungs. I laughed it off and said titles do not pump water. A few men laughed with me, a few did not. The ones who did not were the ones who would matter later, when choices hardened. I filed their faces. When I went below for a swallow of water in the gloom, I found a chalk mark near my hammock hooks that had not been there before, a crude eye. Sailor nonsense. Protection or accusation or boredom. I wiped it with a wet thumb and left the smudge. Erasing clean makes a bigger story than leaving a mess. Let them think the ship simply dirtied itself. Night brought cards played for buttons and debts that would never clear. I sat in for a few hands and lost on purpose in small ways that looked like bad luck rather than strategy. Losing makes you brother to men who need to feel taller. The book under my shirt stayed out of the pot. If anyone had asked to stake a mystery lump under linen, I would have made a joke and shown a rib. No one asked. Cards and rum narrowed the world back to ordinary vices. I blessed every ordinary vice that kept eyes off deeper ink. Before I slept, I whispered the first article once, not for power, for reminder. Captain of my breath. The breath came clean. Crew eyes would keep counting me tomorrow. I would give them a man who hauled, joked, lost at cards, and had nothing in his shirt but sweat. The rest belonged to the cable tier and the dark hiring office under the keel. If I played the meat well enough, the miracle would remain a rumor that died of boredom. Boredom, I was learning, is a tactical resource. I intended to spend it freely. There is a particular loneliness in being watched for the wrong reasons. I had been invisible most of my working life, which is a sailor's cheapest safety. Now invisibility was a job again, harder than hauling, because every success at ordinary tasks became fresh evidence in someone else's private trial. I let the trial run without a defendant. Defendants talk. Talking hangs. When the mate froze on a decision about cutting wreckage, I spoke as if stating weather. We had been fighting a long bight of broken spar and tangled cordage that still hung off the starboard side, slamming the hull with every roll. It was dead weight with a grudge. The carpenter wanted it cut free. The mate wanted to salvage the metal fittings and a stretch of still good yard. Both were right in the small way men are right when they are also tired and afraid of being blamed. The sea did not care about blame. It kept swinging the wreckage like a slow fist. "Cut it," I said. Not loud, not from the quarterdeck. I was at the rail with a hatchet in my hand and salt in my eyes, and the words came out flat, the way you say the glass is falling or the line is frayed. The mate's mouth opened on an argument and closed on nothing. The carpenter's mate already had his saw half lifted. Men moved. Axes bit. The wreckage went with a final knock and a splash that sounded like relief. Patience rode easier inside a dozen breaths. The slam stopped. The hull's complaint dropped a note. No one called it command. Everyone felt the tilt. I went back to coiling the freed ends as if I had only been impatient with noise. Inside, something counted. Not the book this time, me. I had spent no blood, written no clause. The win was nerve and timing, and the crew's hunger for any voice that did not shake. That mattered. If every problem became an article, I would either be God by Tuesday or corpse by Monday, and I had plans that required more days than that. The mate found me later near the scuttlebutt and tried to reframe the moment as his order delayed by thinking. I let him. I even nodded, as if grateful for his careful mind. He relaxed. Men who need the story of their own authority will protect the person who does not steal the story out loud. Useful, slippery. I filed the method next to the bosun's warning about charms. Through the afternoon, I practiced quiet command the way a man practices knots in the dark. A word about the set of a sail when the wind freed a point. A hand signal that moved a hauling gang a pace to the left before someone's foot went through a weak board. A suggestion to the cook that the spoiled beef go overside before it poisoned half the watch. Each time I kept my tone inside the weather. Each time I left room for someone ranked above me to claim the decision if they needed it. Leadership that cannot hide is just a target with better posture. I did not write an article for any of it. The book stayed bound and warm enough to remind me it was still hiring. Appetite pressed, I pressed back. Sometimes nerve is enough, sometimes skill is enough. The deep likes holders who understand tools beyond ink. Or so I told myself to keep from pricking my thumb every hour like a drunk reaching for the bottle. Near evening, the sky took on a greasy look. Not a full blow, a sulk of weather that could turn mean if neglected. I doubled the lashings on the remaining boats without being told. Job helped, chatting about port and fried fish and whether the girls would mind a man with tar under his nails. I said girls mind empty pockets more than tar. He laughed. While we worked, I watched the mate watch the clouds and fail to give the order that would reef us down a hand early. I caught the bosun's eye. He barked the reef without looking at me. Good. Orders that come from the expected mouth keep the machine oiled. After dark, I took the book to a corner of the hold where casks made a room. Lantern thin, pages open, I wrote nothing. I only read the gospel lines again, and the spent ghost of Article 2 and the steady brand of Article 1. Then I spoke aloud, soft, a lesson aimed at both of us, patience. The book did not answer in ink. The leather cooled a fraction, or I imagined it, the way you imagine a horse's mood from the skin. Either way, I closed it unfed. On my way up, I heard two men arguing in whispers about whether storm-born Cal should have the captain's cabin key if the mate kept drinking at the rate he had started. I stopped in shadow and listened until the argument died into grunts. Then I made noise like a man arriving honest and asked them for a hand with a stuck hatch. Work scattered the conspiracy the way light scatters roaches. I did not lecture them. Lecturing claims a pulpit. I wanted no pulpit on patience. Pulpits burn. Still, the fact of the whisper meant the tilt was real. Crews invent captains the way empty seas invent monsters. If I refused every inch, someone worse might take the inches and spend them stupid. If I took too many inches, the book's warning about hanging twice would arrive early, wearing the mate's face or the owner's agents in port. Balance, quiet, weather talk, visible ordinary struggle. I ended the night on watch with my palms on the rail and my eyes on a horizon that refused to show its cards. First quiet command had not been a ceremony. It had been a cut line and a splash and a ship that rode easier. That was the kind of power I wanted to master before I wrote greater articles. Power that looked like sense. Sense is hard to put on trial. Magic is easy. The hangman understands magic. He gets confused by competence. When the bell struck and my relief came, I left him a clean slate and a ship still floating. Under my shirt, the black article waited, unemployed for the moment and no doubt unimpressed. I could live with unimpressed. I could not live with careless. Toward sleep, I repeated the personal law. Leave enough struggle showing. Let them see me tired. Let them see me haul. Let the tilt feel like weather, not like a crown. We limped toward a port that smelled of fried fish and bad decisions long before we saw the roofs. The approach was a maze of sand and pride. Charts lied in the cheerful way colonial charts lie, with soundings taken in better years by men who liked round numbers. The mate wanted a pilot. Pilots cost money and asked questions. The bosun wanted daylight and slow progress, and a man in the chains heaving the lead until his arm fell off. Both wants could be true. What we had was a wounded brig, a nervous crew, and a tide that would not wait for our feelings. Before anchor, before the first official nose came snuffling toward our papers, I went alone into the forepeak with the book and a scrap of page I had already nearly ruined. Lantern, breath, blood, Article 3. For 1 hour in harbor approaches, our sounding leads find true depth. I kept it small. 1 hour, our leads, true depth, no demand that the sand rearrange itself for my glory, no curse on rival hulls, just the chance not to ground and split our already weeping seams within sight of men who would charge us salvage like priests. I bled, I wrote, I whispered. The scrap warmed and the book answered with that now familiar tick of attention. Then I burned the scrap on a tin plate until it was black curl and crushed ash. Ash went overboard through a scupper with a murmur of bilge water. No evidence, no sermons, no page left for a curious hand to find in my shirt if Port Authority decided to search the storm-born fool. On deck, I volunteered for the chains. Lead line in hand, the song of the depths in my mouth, the old calls that tell a helmsman whether the world under the keel is friend or grave. By the marks, deep 4 and a half 3, the numbers came clean. Once, when the color of the water said lie, the lead said truth, and we edged to starboard in time to miss a bar that would have kissed us hard. The pilot we finally took aboard 2 cables later called us lucky for a wreck-looking brig. I smiled with salt-cracked lips and let luck take the bow again. Port opened around us like a mouth. Wharves, warehouses with peeling paint, a fort that had seen better governors. Masts in a thicket, some honest, some with the too clean look of ships that change names the way men change shirts. Smoke rose from cook fires and from forges, and from the kind of tavern chimneys that have heard every lie twice. The air was fish, pitch, overripe fruit, open drains, and money sweating in fists. After weeks of sea, it hit the nose like a slap and a welcome together. We warped in with borrowed boats and expensive goodwill. Lines went to bollards that had held worse ships. The mate went ashore with the remains of the captain's papers and a story about squall and pirates that was true enough to pass if no one smelled the gaps. I stayed aboard for the first hours because a man who rushes into port rumor becomes part of it. Also the book preferred, I thought, a claimable deck under me while strangers' eyes began their count. Rumor still found us. It always does. Boys on the quay wanted the boarding told with more blood. A woman selling oranges wanted to know if we had seen a black flag eastward. A clerk with ink on his fingers wanted cargo manifests and looked disappointed at our wounded totals. Someone said, "Teach his name the way you say hurricane when the season is right, not as a man you expect to meet at the fish stall, as weather that makes insurance clerks drink in the morning." I took leave when the bosun nodded me off and walked the waterfront with empty hands and full ears. Bare feet and cheap shoes mixed on the boards. Soldiers in coats too thick for the heat pretended not to sweat. A preacher tried to sell salvation next to a man selling knives. I bought fried fish wrapped in a scrap of old Gazette and ate it sitting on a piling, just another tar with salt in his hair. The fish tasted like grease and heaven. Ordinary pleasure. I savored it as policy. In a dockside shed that smelled of hemp and mold, I heard 3 men whisper over a cask, not about us, about a Navy sloop due within the week, and a governor's mood and whether the wreck silver trade still paid if you knew which palm to paint. One mentioned teach again, and the other 2 spat for luck. I stayed in shadow long enough to learn the Navy sloop's name and then left before my face became a memory attached to listening. Information is a clause you write without blood if you are patient. Back aboard, patience looked smaller against the town's noise. Repairs had already started with the carpenter haggling like a man in a duel. I put my back into hauling lumber and let my muscles answer questions my mouth would not. When a customs man came over the side with 2 tufts and a smile too wide, I was just a hand with a splinter in his palm. They poked, they peered, they did not find a book. The book was in a waterproof wrap wedged inside a hollow behind a hanging knee in the hold, where I had spent an hour making the wood look unopened for years. Risk to leave it, risk to carry it ashore. I chose the hold and hated every minute of separation like a man hates leaving a loaded pistol in another room. Ash from the scrap was long gone to the harbour fish. Article 3 would die on its hour and leave no child. We had not grounded. The pilot still said lucky. I was building a religion of luck with myself as only priest, and the congregation did not know it was in church. That was the design. In port smoke, under rumour weather named Teach and Navy and Silver, design was the only prayer I trusted. Before I slept, I walked the hold once more and checked the hanging knee by touch alone. Wood seamless, book present. My pulse slowed. Secrecy is a craft with sore fingertips and no applause. I accepted the terms again, the way you accept a reefed sail in rising wind. Not joy. Survival with a plan inside it. I wanted an article that made every Navy powder bloom backward. I wanted an article that opened locks in treasure vaults. I wanted an article that turned hostile decks into mine at a word. I wanted too much, too fast. Night in port is never truly night. Lanterns on other ships, shore noise that thins but does not die. A fiddle somewhere arguing with a drunk. Patience creaked against her lines in a rhythm different from open water, a trapped animal rhythm. I recovered the book from the hanging knee when the watch was dull and the customs smile had gone home to whatever bed bad clerks use. The leather felt cool after the hold. I warmed it against my stomach like a living thing and climbed to the cable tier with a stolen heel of bread and a mind full of greedy sentences. On the page, as if it had been listening to my wants, a pale warning line showed itself. Broken clauses rebound. I believed it the way sailors believe reefs, not as poetry, as geography. A reef does not hate you, it simply sits where your keel wants to be and lets you do the rest. Rebound would be the same. Write a clause too large for your blood, your deck, your witness, and the lean of the world snaps back. I pictured powder blooming in my own face. I pictured locks closing on my fingers. I pictured a deck I had claimed badly vomiting me into the harbour like spoiled fruit. The pictures were enough. So I wrote nothing greedy that night. Instead, I oiled my knife until the cloth came away clean. I repaired a torn cuff with small, neat stitches, like a man planning to hang of old age, which was the funniest lie on the sea. I cleaned the fid of old brown and did not ask it how many throats it had helped. Ordinary maintenance is a kind of clause too. It says you expect a tomorrow. The book stayed open on my knees while I worked, patient and faintly insulted, if leather can be insulted. I spoke to it under breath because silence can become a different hunger. Not today, not vaults, not Navy magazines, not yet. Greater decks first, then greater articles. The deep is hiring, but hired men still choose when to sign the dayboard. Maybe that was bravado. Bravado keeps the hand from shaking when it would otherwise write suicide in elegant ink. I thought about article shapes the way a carpenter thinks about joints. A good clause would be bounded in time, bounded in place, bounded in who it touched. Enemy locks for one glass on this deck had worked because it was narrow enough to force through reality's throat. Sounding leads for 1 hour had worked because it asked the world to tell truth, not to rebuild the coastline. Wide wishes are blunt. Blunt tools slip. Slip is rebound's cousin. I also thought about cost beyond rebound. Every article I wrote lived in me after. Breath still answered differently. The crew's eyes still measured. Luck still stuck to my name like pitch. Power changes the holder even when the page goes pale. Write too many small clauses and you might arrive at the large ones already half spent as a person, addicted to the lean, unable to stand a fair fight. I had loved the loaded dice of unfair wind. Love like that needs a leash. Footsteps near the hatch. I closed the book, killed the light, became a man oiling a knife in the dark for reasons of thrift. The bosun's voice asked who was lurking. I answered with my name and the truth about the cuff and the knife. He came down far enough to see my hands and not far enough to see my shirt. Carry on, he said, and then, softer, port makes men stupid. Do not be stupid for me to clean up. I promised nothing and he left anyway. Promises are loud, work is quiet. Alone again, I risked one more look at the warning line. Broken clauses rebound, under it, fainter, almost shy, another ghost of prior holders, a half-word that might have been king, a blot, a date that belonged to a century with worse wigs. I shut it. Archaeology could wait. I was not here to inherit their unfinished suicides. On deck, the port wind brought frying oil and sewage, and a sweet rot from fruit crates smashed on the quay. I stood at the rail and watched a Navy cutter's boat move across the harbor like a thought the town did not want to have. Not the sloop of rumor yet, a smaller bite, enough to remind every crooked mast to sit up straight for an hour. I kept my posture ordinary, my hands visible, my neckerchief plain, no book bulge if I could help it. The cutter boat passed and did not turn its nose toward patience. Rebound delayed. Good. What I would not write yet was a list I kept without paper. No weather stolen from whole bays, no obedience forced on crews who had not chosen me, no death clauses that named men across horizons I had never seen. Those were God games. I was still learning knife games. The deep could hire. I could still negotiate by refusal. Before sleep, I bound the book flat again and lay with it under my thigh and the fid in my fist. Dreams came as blank pages waiting for blood, and on each page my greedy sentences tried to form, and on each page the reef line broke them. I woke once to my own whisper refusing. The cabin air was stale. A drunk laughed on the quay. Patience tugged her lines. I slept again like a man who had not signed away his morning, which was, for that night, the only victory that mattered. I made tea from scorched crumbs and hot water and drank it bitter while the warning line stayed pale on the page. Bitter keeps a man honest. Sweet stories about unlimited power are how holders end up as cautionary chalk marks on prison walls. I wanted no wall named after me. I wanted decks and time and the right to refuse a sentence that would rebound through people who had never asked to share my hire. In a dockside shed, I heard men whisper teach as if saying storm. Black flag, slow fuse in a beard, a navy out for theatre blood. The details changed depending on the mouth. One man swore Teach had blockaded a whole inlet with smoke alone. Another said he took ships by staring. A third, older, only drank and said the man understood fear better than gunnery, and fear is cheaper than powder when it works. None of them spoke as witnesses. All of them spoke as people living downwind of a legend. I felt the temptation like a warm hand on the tiller. Steer toward that smoke. Hitch my book to his weather, become a smaller thunder under a larger cloud, and rise faster than a 19-year-old hand has any right to rise. The deep had hired me, the page had said. Maybe the deep had hired several. Maybe legends were just holders who stopped hiding. My mouth watered on the thought and then went dry on the next one. Footnotes die when the main text burns. If I tied my secret lore to his public theater, I would inherit his hunters without inheriting his decks. I refused, not with a speech. Speeches are for men who need witnesses. I refused in the quiet of my own skull while pretending to examine a coil of rope for sale. I would not be a footnote in another man's myth if the deep had put a pen in my hand directly. Still, the era was his weather, and I would sail in it, steal in it, and outgrow it. You do not ignore a hurricane because you dislike the hurricane's name. You reef, you point, you use the edge winds if you can do it without being eaten. Outside the shed, the port went about its crooked noon. I walked with Job, who had followed me ashore like a friendly debt. He wanted rumors the way some men want sweets. Did I think Teach was 10 feet tall? Did I think the Navy would hang every free sloop to make a point? I said tall tales grow in heat and hangmen love easy necks. Job frowned, cheated of romance. I bought him a cup of something sour and cheap and watched his shoulders loosen. Keep your crew fed and slightly disappointed in your poetry. It prevents worship. We passed a printer's window where a broadsheet shouted about piracy and virtue in language that had never smelled bilge. There was a crude cut of a bearded man with matches that looked like a hedgehog on fire. Children laughed at it. A soldier frowned at it. I studied the lines of the face as if I might meet it and decided the art was useless. Real danger rarely poses for woodcuts. Real danger looks like a sail where you hoped for empty horizon. Later, alone, I sat on Patience's deck with a borrowed glass and watched the harbour mouth. Weather is pattern. Teach as weather meant certain lanes becoming expensive, certain ports growing thick with informers, certain governors needing a capture the way a sick man needs a bleeding. That pattern would move prizes and panic around the map. A smart holder could ride the panic's edge, taking ships while Navy eyes stared at bigger smoke. A stupid holder could try to match the smoke and get special attention with a special rope. The book under my shirt stayed quiet through these thoughts. No ink rose to say seek him or flee him. The Deep's hiring was not a chain of command. It was an opening. What I built in the opening was my problem. Good. I have never loved officers. The mate returned from shore meetings with wine on his breath and a signed mess of papers that would let us repair on credit against cargo. He announced this as triumph. The bosun read the numbers and looked like a man swallowing a toad. I glanced once, enough to know we were being gently skinned, and went back to hauling planks. Quiet command does not always mean speaking. Sometimes it means not giving the mate a fight he would lose in public and avenge in private. Near dusk, a free black caulker came aboard with tools and a reputation for sealing miracles. He worked fast and sang under breath in a language I did not have. Between seams he asked, casual, if we had crossed the bearded storm eastward. I said we had crossed a squall and a sloop with dishonest colours, and that was enough weather for one voyage. He nodded as if I had passed a small test and said men who chase smoke forget where their own feet are. Then he sealed another seam and the moment closed. I paid attention to his hands more than his advice, but the advice sat right beside my own refusal. That night I wrote no article. I did write, on ordinary paper with ordinary ink, a list of lanes and seasons and the kind of merchant that panics first when legends walk. Information is a deck you claim with patience. I slept on that list and on the book and on the decision not to kneel to another man's thunder. Teach would remain weather. I would remain a man learning to make local climate in secret. If our storms ever met, I intended to be the one who understood the difference between smoke and law. Smoke blinds everyone. Law, written narrow and paid in blood, blinds only the people you aim it at. That was the edge I meant to keep sharp while the era howled someone else's name. Before going back aboard, I stood at the end of a wharf and watched open water beyond the bar. Weather has no face when you are honest about it. Teach was a system of fear moving through lanes and letters. I would chart that system the way I charted currents, without kneeling to the wave. Outgrow, not outshout. The difference would keep me breathing long enough to matter. I repeated the refusal once more before sleep, not as a prayer, as a navigation mark. Do not hitch the book to his smoke. Sail the era. Do not kneel to it. Reef early. Keep your own name. First law, never show the book. Second, never write an article you cannot survive if it rebounds. Third, claim a deck before you try to rule a sea. Fourth, personal. Leave enough ordinary struggle visible that men do not start prayers in my direction. Prayers attract chaplains and hangmen. I repeated the laws until the bilge stink felt like incense. It was the second night in port, repairs half done, crew half drunk, town half watching. I had the book on my knees again in the low dark and a stub of candle that smelled of cheap tallow. This was not gospel fever like the cable tier message. This was slow work, the carving of rails you mean to hold when the deck pitches. I spoke each law. Then I wrote them not in blood, but in ordinary pencil on the inside cover's edge, small, where a casual opener might miss them. The book allowed pencil as a man allows a child to chalk a wall. No heat, no binding, memory aids only. Binding would come if I ever bled on those lines, and I was not ready to make my own caution into unbreakable chain. Around the laws, I built a second ring of practical habits. Always know 2 hiding places for the book. Always have a reason to be alone that looks like work. Never write when angry. Never write when drunk. Never write because a man looked at me wrong. Anger, rum, and pride are the 3 cheap inks that ruin holders. I had seen men ruin themselves with less. I tested the breath article softly, not for need, for calibration. Inhale, own, exhale. The ease was still there, clean as a wiped blade. So some clauses root, others spend and fade. I needed a sense of which was which before I tried anything that touched powder or loyalty, or wind across a whole bay. Rooted power is identity. Spent power is a tool. Confuse them and you start believing you are the weather instead of a thief who steals weather in measured cups. A rat watched me from a coil with the calm of a landlord. I saluted it with 2 fingers and went back to thinking about rebound. Broken clauses rebound. The warning had not explained the geometry. Did rebound hit the writer only? The deck? The witnesses? If I wrote a bad article on patience, would Job pay for my greed? That thought alone was worth a law. Fifth, then, still personal, still unwritten in blood, do not spend crew as fuel. Use them as crew. If the deep wanted a monster who burned his own to feed a page, it could hire elsewhere. Maybe it would. Maybe I would die pure and poor. I could live with pure and poor longer than I could live with becoming the kind of story that makes children afraid of the wrong things. I thought of counters. Navy discipline is a kind of deep law. Paper and powder and flags that millions pretend are holy. Storms are older law. Rival holders, if they existed, would be knives in the same drawer. Secrecy was my first shield. Narrow clauses were my second. Visible competence without visible magic was my third. If I ever got a true deck, men who chose articles by voice and share would be my fourth, because willing witnesses stick better than terrified ones. That last was guesswork. Guesswork becomes plan if you survive enough tests. Above, laughter spiked and died. A bottle broke. Someone cursed a woman who was not present to defend herself. Port night. I stayed in my incense bilge and made a mental map of Patience's bones. Every void, every hanging knee, every place a customs hand had already poked. Hiding places are temporary. Eventually, the book would need a ship that was mine enough to become part of the keel's idea of itself. Claimable deck. The phrase had become a nail I kept hammering. I turned to a blank page and did not write an article. I wrote in pencil questions. What counts as witness? Does the sea itself witness? Does blood dry too fast on hot days? Can a clause be ended early by the writer? Can a clause be transferred? The page took the pencil and gave nothing back. Good. A book that answers every question is a book training you to stop thinking. I wanted answers earned. When my eyes burned, I closed everything, hid the book in the primary void, and went up to show my face among men. The fourth law demanded appearance. I took a short pull from an offered bottle, coughed, laughed at a joke that was not funny, and helped carry a snoring gunner to his hammock. Ordinary, useful, slightly tired, no halo. The bosun saw me and did not frown, which was as close as he came to blessing. Later, I recovered the book and slept with it again, because separation still felt like missing a finger. Laws ran through my head in the false starts of dreams. Never show, survive rebound, claim deck, hide the miracle in work, do not burn the crew. Somewhere under those, the hiring line still glowed. Greater articles, greater decks. The laws were not a refusal of greatness. They were the price schedule I refused to ignore. At first light, I woke with the pencil laws still legible on the cover edge and my thumb uncut. That restraint felt like the first true command I had given myself since the drowning. The sea had hesitated for me once. I would not stutter my life away in return. I would write when the claws and the deck and the blood made a triangle that could stand weight. Until then, the black article would remain a secret scripture, and I would remain its only reader, priest, and reluctant choir. I ended the private service by touching the clasp and promising the dark nothing but patience. Laws are worthless if they only sound fine in bilge incense. They have to hold when a pistol is at your cheek and the greedy sentence is already half formed. I had already lived that test once. I meant to live it cleaner the next time, with the laws riding my wrist like a cuff I had chosen. I slept sitting up with the book under my thigh and a fid in my fist. Hammocks are honest for tired men and treacherous for men with secrets. They spill you if you thrash. They display your shape to anyone who walks past with a lantern and a curiosity. So I made a nest in a corner of the hold where spare sailcloth stacked into a chair of sorts, back to solid wood, sight-line to the ladder, book pinned by bone and cloth, fid ready to become a reason for someone to regret their hands. Sleep with one eye is a proverb until you practice it. Then it becomes a skill with a cost paid in headaches and ugly dreams. Dreams came as blank pages waiting for blood. Sometimes I wrote perfect clauses and watched them rebound into my mouth as salt water. Sometimes the red-sashed master from the boarding held the book over a harbor and asked me what I would pay. Sometimes Teach walked past as weather, not a man, a pressure system with a beard, and every ship in my dream reefed without being told. I woke from that one with my heart loud and my breath still mine to captain. Small mercy. I woke another time to a change in the anchor watch, a scuff and a whisper where there should have been only the slow step of a bored man. My hand went to the clasp before my mind finished naming the threat. Almost wrote an article out of pure startle. The sentence formed, ugly and wide, something about freezing feet on my ladder. I stopped myself hard enough that my jaw clicked. Ears first, eyes second, ink last, always. Only a drunk mate trying to find a cask he had already emptied and arguing with a stay about it. Ordinary danger, good. Ordinary danger keeps you sharp without spending miracles. I let him pass in his cloud of wine and self-pity, and did not announce that I had been ready to lean the world on him for stumbling. The book cooled as if disappointed. I was learning to disappoint it. That felt like health. Port nights are long when your nerves work for a living. Ashore, a dog barked a conversation with another dog. A woman sang 3 lines of a song and forgot the 4th. Water slapped the hull in the short, nasty chop of a harbor. Patience, tide, still moved enough to remind you that rope is not land. I catalogued every sound until the catalogue became a kind of boring prayer, and boring finally dragged me under. In the grey before dawn, I checked the book by touch, still there, still closed. Pencil laws, still a faint roughness under my thumb on the cover edge. I rose stiff, hid the packet, and went on deck to take a turn at looking useful. The watch nodded. Someone handed me a cup of something hot that had only a distant cousinship with coffee. I drank it and felt human in the small ways that prevent myths. The carpenter was already up, arguing with a delivery of lumber that was more knot than wood. I helped sort and let my back hurt openly. Fourth law, visible struggle. A boy from shore tried to sell us oranges and news. The news was half navy, half teach, half invented, which is too many halves, which means all of it was entertainment. I bought 2 oranges anyway and tossed one to Job when he appeared with sleep in his eyes. He grinned like the fruit was a medal. Mid-morning brought a scare with no magic in it. A heavier vessel walked out too carelessly and kissed our bowsprit hard enough to crack a spar tip and dump a man from their head ropes into the water. Chaos, hooks, shouts. I was first at our rail with a line because I was near and because speed looks like character. We fished their sailor out sputtering. Their mate apologized with coins. Our mate accepted with dignity he had not earned. No articles, no blood, just a wet man alive and a spar we would now have to shave and partner. My hands shook after, not from fear, from the aftertaste of almost writing at the first night noise. Restraint has a tremble too. I took that tremble into the cable tier at noon heat when most men sought shade and sleep. Book open, no new ink. I told it, soft, that I would sleep with one eye as long as I had to, and that startle would not be a signature. If the deep wanted a holder who wrote at every creak, it could hire a child. The leather stayed neutral. Neutrality I could work with. That afternoon I practiced something new. I left the book hidden and walked the full length of the ship and out onto the quay and back, counting my panic like beads. Separation. 10 minutes, 20. An hour on the quay, listening to corkers and not dying. The book did not burn the hold in my absence. I did not dissolve. Dependence, leashed a little, barked and then lay down. When I recovered the packet, the clasp was cool. I exhaled a laugh that sounded cracked and private. Evening closed with the crew quieter, money thinner, repairs advanced. I ate hard bread and onions and listened to men plan shore leave they would regret. I planned a sleep schedule like a campaign. 2 hours, sit, sleep. Watch, 2 hours, watch. The fid wore a polish from my grip. One eye became a metaphor again, only after both eyes burned too much to play games. Even then I kept the book under my thigh until true exhaustion flattened me into a sleep without pages, without beards, without rebound, just black, the honest kind. I woke from that black to bell and duty and the knowledge that I was still alive, still secret, still hired, and still choosing when to spend the hire. For a man who had drowned weeks before, that choice felt like the real treasure in the hold. Between watches, I taught myself to wake at the change of feet on deck without reaching for ink. 3 nights of practice put a little space between sound and spell. That space is where skill lives. Magic shoved into every gap leaves no room for becoming dangerous in ordinary ways, and ordinary danger is still most of a sailor's war. At first light, Patience looked like a survivor, which is a kind of invitation. Her new scars were patched with lumber that still smelled of the yard. Fresh tar drew black seams across old wounds. The jury rig would get us out if we did not ask it to be beautiful. Ashore, the port was already sweating into its day. Smoke rising, vendors shouting, a church bell insisting on a god who kept poor time with tides. Beyond the bar, past the dirty green of shallow water, the deeper blue waited with richer hulls and fatter holds, and men who still believed flags were physical laws. I breathed as captain of my breath and felt the sea listen a fraction closer than it listened to other drowning men who had come back empty. That fraction was not enough to rule anything. It was enough to promise. I stood on the foredeck with a mug cooling in my hands and ran the voyage in my head like a ledger. Drowned, found the book, wrote breath, survived boarding with a narrow clause and a fid, hid the scripture, refused greedy ink, refused to kneel to teach his weather, made laws, slept with one eye, kept the crew's math from turning into prayer. Promise of the chapter, if chapters exist outside of books like mine, paid in full. I was alive. The black article was secret. The Deep's hiring notice still stood. Now the ledger wanted a new line. Greater decks, not patience, not forever. She had been a cradle and a claimable field for one glass of failed locks, and I owed her the respect you owe any tool that keeps you breathing. But she belonged to owners who would never sign my articles. She would crawl homeward with whatever cargo we salvaged and a story about luck, and I would not be on her when she became ordinary again. That decision settled quiet and firm, like a keel block taking weight. I would take a deck that mattered, a sloop first, maybe, something fast with teeth, won by nerve and narrow law, and men who preferred shares to wages, then larger, then commandments that made local sea and ship reality lean until ports lowered flags without understanding why their hands moved. Kings would call me weather if I did it right, not because I smoked my beard for theater, because their orders arrived second to mine in places they thought they owned. I would hang twice only if I got stupid, and I did not intend to get stupid. Job found me and asked if I thought we would sail tomorrow. I said the day after if the caulking held and the mate stayed sober enough to sign the last chits. Job wanted to know if I would stay with patience after. I looked at the horizon long enough to make the silence answer first. Then I said a man stays where the work is. He heard what he needed. I had heard what I needed too. Some would follow a quiet tilt, some would not. Crew is a deck of another kind. Claim carefully. The bosun passed, ear ugly and healing, and stopped as if he had smelled the thought on me. You look like a man measuring another ship, he said. I told him I was measuring the bar and the wind. He snorted. Do not get yourself hanged in a pretty way. Pretty corpses help governors sleep. I promised him nothing again, and he seemed to prefer that. We stood a moment sharing the view like two animals at a waterhole who have not yet decided on rivalry. Then he went aft and bellowed at a landsman handling a line like it was a snake. I took the book, carefully, in a quiet run to the cable tier during the breakfast clutter when eyes were on food. Opened. Article 1 steady, warning steady, hiring line still a coal. I did not write, I only rested my cut thumb near the margin and felt the old pull to pay and wish. Toward greater decks, I told it without ink, not this page today, soon. The leather warmed as if the intention itself were a kind of interest payment. I closed the clasp, bound the oilcloth, returned the packet to my chest. Separation time was over for the morning. We had a bar to cross and a sea to rejoin. By afternoon, the mate announced departure on the next favorable tide. Men cheered with the thin cheer of people who are tired of port prices. I cheered enough to blend. Inside, the cliff opened under my thoughts, not a fall, a height. Out there were navy sloops with honest colors and dishonest intent, merchantmen fat with the wreck Silver Age's leftovers, pirates who had only steel and stories, and somewhere the pressure system called Teach rearranging fear. Out there were decks waiting to be claimed by someone who understood that law is a weapon if you write it narrow and pay it true. I smiled like luck and hid like scripture. When we cast off, lines splashed free, and Patience edged her battered body toward the channel. I took the lead line again and sang the depths clean. No Article 3 this time, just skill and memory and the sea's ordinary honesty under the keel. We cleared the bar without drama. Open water lifted us. The port shrank to a smudge of smoke and bad decisions. Ahead, the horizon was a blank page the color of possibility. The deep had hired me. I planned to collect, not as a footnote, not as a beard's echo, as Calder Vane, Cal to the careless, captain of my breath, holder of the black article, on my way toward decks large enough to make the world sign where I pointed. The book ticked once against my ribs, a second heart made of law. I kept my eyes on the blue and my hands ordinary on the line, and if anyone asked what I was grinning at, I would have said the wind, which was fair and unfair and mine to learn. I touched the rail as we cleared the last shoal mark and felt patience answer like a tired animal still willing. Cradle, I thought again, not throne. Somewhere ahead a deck waited that could take a true claim, witnesses who chose shares and articles written with room to survive the snapback. I did not know its name yet. I knew my own, Calder Vane, captain of my breath, hired, collecting.